They will tell you it was just an orphanage, they will tell you the children were cared for, fed, taught, and sent to good families far away. They will not tell you what was buried in the woods, or why the ground still refuses to grow grass there. You think you know the nature of evil. You imagine it as something loud, obvious, a thing that roars when it kills. But here, in Medina County, Ohio, in 1856, evil did not roar. It whispered. It wore Sunday clothes. It shook hands with ministers. And it called itself charity. The Grimby Home for displaced children stood 3 miles outside town, at the end of a dirt road no one traveled unless they had reason. The locals said it was a place of Christian mercy, a sanctuary for the broken and unwanted. But I am telling you now, mercy had nothing to do with it. For 5 years, the Grimby family received the state's praise, church donations, and the unblinking trust of a small community. Not once did an inspector file a complaint. Not once did the county doctor make a house call. They told themselves this meant the children were well. But tell me, since when does silence prove innocence? The first hint came not from a sheriff, nor a preacher, but from a traveling photographer named Edmund Hartwell. He was there to document institutions for the state welfare report, simple work. Photograph the classrooms, the dormitories, the staff. But Hartwell noticed something no one else dared see. There was no sound. No laughter. No footsteps. Only the sterile quiet of a place that had forgotten what life felt like. That he would later find words scratched into a bench, 3 words that should have been enough to tear the whole facade apart. Help us. Small, jagged letters carved by a hand too young to hold a blade steady. The truth, though, was buried deeper. Beneath the lies in the ledgers. Beneath the floorboards. Beneath the soil itself. 2. NTY 3 small graves, hidden under layers of lime and time. 23 names erased from the books, each one written instead into the dark ledger the Grimby family kept in secret. And here's the thing you must understand before we go any further: the world does not hide its monsters in shadows. It seats them at the head of the table, lets them say grace, and trusts them with the children. Hartwell didn't sleep the night he left the Grimby property. That he couldn't. That silence clung to him, followed him down the rutted road, settled into his bones. It wasn't the natural quiet of a disciplined schoolroom, it was the kind of quiet you find in a sealed tomb. In his photographs, the building looked plain, almost unremarkable. But Hartwell knew better. He had seen the way Jeremiah Grimby's eyes lingered on him, not with suspicion, but with calculation. As if he were already measuring where Hartwell would fit into the earth if he asked the wrong question. The next weeks in Cincinnati should have been routine, developing plates, delivering prints, writing dry summaries for state records. But the carved words wouldn't leave him. Help us. He saw them every time the lamplight hit his desk, just so, as though they'd been burned into the wood grain of his mind. So he began asking questions. Quietly, at first. Other photographers. Inspectors. Clerks. He wanted to know what was normal in these places. The answers chilled him: bustling corridors, children at play, artwork on the walls, meals that smelled of fresh bread and stews. But none of that existed at the Grimby home. No letters from adopted children. No repeat sightings of the same child year after year. Then he spoke with Samuel Hutchkins, a clerk at the Department of Public Welfare. Over lunch, Hutchkins admitted something no one else would: their records are perfect. Too perfect. No one's ever sick. No one's ever in trouble. No one's ever there twice. That's when Hartwell began to see the shape of the thing. The transfers were always out west. Always vague. Always impossible to verify. The Grimby family had built an invisible pipeline, one that ended somewhere far from the eyes of the state. That he dug into their files. 127 children gone in 5 years. Not a single letter back. Not a sigh. Angle witness who could say they'd seen a child from the Grimby home after leaving it. Hartwell didn't have proof yet. Not enough to break them open. But he had something else, an image he'd missed before. A face. Pressed to the glass in the background of a dining hall photograph. Eyes wide. Mouth half open. A moment caught between fear and hope. You need to remember this, because from here forward, the descent begins. Once you see their faces, you can never unsee them. Hartwell returned to Medina County in late October, but this time, he didn't announce himself. No official letters. No camera case swinging from his side. He came alone, on horseback, carrying only a field journal, a small pair of army-issued binoculars, and the kind of patience you need when you're stalking predators. The town itself gave him nothing. In the tavern, in the general store, at the church, people smiled politely, changed the subject, or told him they didn't know much about the Grimby home. But their eyes betrayed them. A flicker. A quick dart toward the floor. The small, involuntary shift of someone who's heard the rumors and wishes they hadn't done it. Was the general storekeeper, Sarah Kellerman, who finally cracked. She told him the Grimbys never came into town for children's clothes or toys. Only for flour, salt, lye, kerosene, and lime. Too much lime, she whispered, as though the word itself might draw attention. And they never carry it home themselves. Always have it delivered. Straight to the back of the property. That was enough to put Hartwell where he needed to be, on a small rise, 200 yards from the orphanage, hidden in a grove of oaks. The binoculars turned the Grimby property into a stage. For 3 days, he watched. No children outside. No laundry drying. No smoke curling from the chimney at breakfast. The only real movement came after sundown, when Caleb Grimby would emerge with bundles wrapped in canvas or burlap. Some large, some small. Many far too small. Caleb would load them onto a cart, take them into the forest behind the staff quarters, and vanish into the dark. Hartwell could never hear much, but one night, the wind shifted. It brought him the sound of shovels biting into earth. On the third night, there were more lights, lanterns moving in a careful pattern among the trees. He counted at least 3 figures, all working. In silence. The digging went on for hours. And though the night was cold, Hartwell swore he could smell the lime. You must understand, this was not negligence. It was not cruelty born of poverty. What Hartwell was witnessing was procedure. A ritual of concealment, repeated enough times to become muscle memory. From that moment, Hartwell knew, the Grimby home was not a sanctuary. It was a machine. And the children were its fuel. By the 4th day, Hartwell's hands itched to act. He'd seen enough to convince any reasonable man that something was deeply wrong on that property. But this wasn't Cincinnati. Here, justice moved at the speed of old friendships and unspoken debts. That he rode into the county seat and asked for Sheriff William Bradenton. The man looked like he'd been carved from a tree stump, thick shoulders, a neck that disappeared into his collar, and a permanent squint from years in the sun. Bradenton listened without interrupting as Hartwell laid out what he'd seen, the silence, the bundles, the digging in the night. When Hartwell finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair and sighed. Mr. Hartwell, the Grimbys have been pillars of this community for over a decade. They've taken in more children than anyone else in the state. We've never had a complaint, not from the church, not from the state, not from the children themselves. Hartwell leaned forward. Perhaps because the children don't live long enough to complain. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. You're making dangerous accusations. In a place like Medina, a man's word is his bond. And Jeremiah Grimby's word carries a lot more weight here than yours. There it was, the wall Hartwell had expected. Not made of evidence or reason, but of loyalty. The kind that kept secrets buried deeper than bodies. Still, Hartwell pressed. He showed the sheriff the photograph of the child's face in the dining hall window. Bradenton stared at it longer than Hartwell expected. Something in his jaw tightened. But when he spoke again, his voice was all iron. Even if I believed you, I'd need proof. More than shadows and photographs. Hartwell realized then that he wasn't just up against the Grimby family, he was up against the entire architecture of a small-town system designed to protect its own, even at the cost of its children, but proof was something he could get. And in that moment, he made a decision that would pull him into the very heart of the Grimby machine. There's a point in any investigation where the truth stops being something you uncover, and starts being something you pay for. Hartwell was about to make that payment in full. That night, the air in Medina turned sharp and wet, the kind of cold that made the wood of the old buildings groan. Hartwell waited until the last lantern on the Grimby property went dark. He stood at the edge of their land, his breath curling into the air, eyes fixed on the hulking silhouette of the orphanage. From here, the place looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum, its shutters half closed like the dead lids of a giant, watching him without moving. Somewhere in that blackness, he knew, children slept, or didn't. He moved low through the grass, every step a test of silence. His boots touched the frozen earth without sound, but the night itself seemed to be listening. There was no wind. No insects. Not even the sound of the nearby river. Only the faint crackle of a lantern wick from inside the barn. That was where they'd taken the bundles the night before. Hartwell approached it, his hand grazing the revolver at his hip, not for protection, but to remind himself that this was more than a night walk. This was trespass. And if the Grimbys caught him, the sheriff wouldn't be his savior. The sliding door groaned as he inched it open, just wide enough to slip through. The smell hit him first, earth, rot, and something metallic. He lit his small oil lamp, holding the flame low to avoid casting long shadows. That's when he saw them, rows of shallow pits, each lined with rough planks. Some were covered with loose boards. Others were open, filled with burlap sacks that twitched ever so slightly. Hartwell froze. A sound came from one of the pits, a muffled whimper, quick and sharp, like something trying not to be heard. His breath caught. He crouched beside it and peeled back the burlap. A child's face stared up at him, pale and wide-eyed, lips cracked and trembling. Before he could speak, before he could even reach in, the barn door slammed shut behind him. The light vanished, leaving only the child's terrified breathing, and the sound of boots crossing the floor toward him. Hartwell's fingers tightened on the edge of the pit as the boots drew closer. They weren't hurried. They weren't angry. They were deliberate, the slow, measured stride of someone who already knew exactly where he was. He didn't turn at first. His instincts screamed to keep the child in sight, but his gut knew what that sound meant. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was the end of a very short game the Grimbys had let him play. A match flared in the dark, its orange halo briefly revealing a gaunt, sun-cracked face, Jebediah Grimby. The old man's eyes caught the light for an instant, glinting like wet stones. Before he touched the flame to a lantern, the barn bloomed in a sickly glow. And now Hartwell saw them all. 5 figures stood between him and the door. 2 older boys, broad-shouldered, the kind of muscle that comes from farm work and cruelty. A woman in a tattered shawl, her hair in thick ropes, clutching what looked disturbingly like a shepherd's crook. And in the corner, leaning on a post, was the sheriff. Hartwell's chest went cold. "You been sniffin' around where you ain't welcome," Jebediah said, his voice slow and rasping, like he enjoyed shaping every word. "Thought you might have heard stories. Folks do. But you come walkin' in anyhow." Hartwell rose to his feet, the revolver now in his hand, but he didn't raise it. "Not yet. There's a child in here," he said, his voice steady. Jebediah's lips curled in something between a smile and a snarl. "There's lots o' things in here that look like children." The woman stepped forward, crook tapping on the barn floor, and Hartwell realized the pits went deeper than they looked, descending into some narrow shaft in the earth. Something moved down there, shifting in the straw and dirt. Not just one thing. Dozens. The sheriff finally spoke. "Put that gun down, Hartwell. You think you're the first to come here? Why? Oh, you ain't. You'll end up like the rest." The child in the pit whimpered again, but this time the sound was joined by others, soft, uneven, all around him, like the earth itself was breathing. That's when Hartwell understood. The barn wasn't a place for storage. It was a lid. The lantern light wavered, casting long shadows that bent unnaturally across the walls. Hartwell kept the revolver low, his thumb resting on the hammer, but his gaze locked on the pit. Something down there shifted again, wet, deliberate, and too large to be a child. Jebediah stepped closer, his boots crunching on straw. "Ain't no use lookin' so set, Hartwell. You walk into the ground's mouth, you don't walk back out." Hartwell's jaw tightened. "What's in there?" The woman with the crook chuckled, a low, broken sound. "What's left," she said. She prodded the rim of the pit with her staff, and whatever was below stirred, the straw rustling like dry paper over meat. The sheriff's voice came from the doorway. "It's older than this town. Older than my badge, older than your God." He took off his hat slowly, like he was in church. "The Grimbys just feed it." Hartwell moved a step toward the child, but instantly the two broad-shouldered boys shifted, blocking his line. They were young, but their eyes were as empty as a winter field. The lantern swayed. Hartwell caught sight of something pale in the depths, a face. Or what had once been a face. Its skin was slack, its eyes glossy, but its mouth worked silently, like it was trying to remember how to form words. The boy in the pit whimpered again, and Hartwell's stomach knotted when the pale thing turned toward the sound, not with curiosity, but hunger. Jebediah knelt, holding the lantern out over the opening. "It don't kill them quick," he said, his voice almost tender. "It keeps them for later. That's why the voices stay." The pale shape rose higher, and now Hartwell saw the truth. It wasn't climbing. It was being lifted, by something black and slick, coiling up from the depths. The two boys moved in on Hartwell. One reached for his arm, the other for the gun. Hartwell struck the first in the temple with the barrel and hoved the second back, firing once into the dirt near Jebediah's boots. The lantern fell, shattering against the edge of the pit. Oil spilled in a sudden flare, shadows thrashing against the barn walls. And in that chaos, Hartwell heard a sound he'd never forget, something massive shifting below, waking fully. Then the floor began to tremble. The boards groaned under Hartwell's boots, each tremor rattling through the barn like a death knell. Dust poured from the rafters in choking clouds. Somewhere in the dark, the caged hens shrieked and beat their wings, as if they could sense the thing below had come alive. From the pit, a blast of air surged upward, stinking of rotted earth, stagnant water, and something far fouler. Hartwell staggered back, his eyes watering, as a deep, resonant vibration hummed through the floor. It wasn't a growl. It was breathing. The slick, black coil uncurled further, thick as a fence post, glistening with a mucus-like sheen. In the brief flare of the fallen lantern's flame, he saw it was not smooth. Rows upon rows of spined ridges lined its length, twitching independently like the gills of some bottom-feeding predator. The woman with the crook raised her arms and began to hum, a strange, rhythmic chant that made the hairs on Hartwell's neck stand on end. The two boys dropped to their knees in perfect unison, eyes rolled back, lips moving in time with the woman's song. The coil rose higher, and now Hartwell could see that it wasn't a single limb. It was many, twisting together, each tipped with something like a hooked claw. And beneath them, something began to emerge from the darkness. That he caught a flash of it, white, bulbous, wet. The head swayed, studded with small, glassy eyes in clusters, none blinking, all fixed in different directions. When its mouth opened, Hartwell's mind screamed at him to look away. That it wasn't teeth. It was hands. Hundreds of tiny, gray, malformed hands clung to the inside of its maw, each one twitching and clawing at the air. They weren't just growing there, they were human. The fingers were calloused, bitten, some with fingernails broken to the quick. Hartwell's stomach turned violently. He recognized one of the rings on those fingers, silver, etched with a pattern he'd seen earlier on the missing preacher's photograph. A deep, wet voice slithered into his skull without passing through his ears, hungry. The floor buckled. One of the massive limbs smashed up through the boards, scattering straw and splinters. A support beam snapped with a gunshot crack. Hartwell fired twice, the shots deafening in the enclosed space. The rounds sank into the thing with no more resistance than shooting into mud. It didn't flinch, it laughed, and then the first limb wrapped around his leg. They hauled him like game, the barn floor a blur beneath his boots. The limb that had wrapped his leg tightened with patient, inexorable force, and Hartwell felt bone-deep the animal logic of whatever lived under that earth. He kicked and struck, flurries of motion against a maw that did not react as a beast, it regarded him as inevitability. The two boys hauled him toward the pit, faces set like instruments, efficient and untroubled by conscience. The sheriff watched, hands still. Hartwell's palms hit rough plank at the lip of the hole. The air pouring up was worse than rot, it was memory and calculation, the scent of graves stirred by rain. Something vast shifted beneath them and the barn coughed out air smelling of silt and iron. The child from the burlap clung to Hartwell's wrist with a grip that would not loosen, small knuckles white, nails scorched. The child's eyes held a stare wider than any play demanded. "Please," Hartwell said once, the word like a coin thrown into a well. "You can't, this." He searched their faces for shame, for fear. Instead he found ritual. Jebediah's mouth quirked with a cold affection. "We keep the books," he said. "We keep the balance. Plenty out there take what they can. We make sure the town stands." Neighbors pressed close, lanterns crowding the night like watchful stars. Not one stepped forward. They held their breath, as if the taking required silence to be complete. Hartwell's photographs, his notes, his evidence meant nothing here, law surrendered to a contract older than statutes. He realized, with hollow clarity, that the county's mercy had a price settled in blood. The limb released him briefly, letting gravity do the work. He fell forward over the pit rim and plunged into a world smelling of lime and old promises. Voices rose, chants, low kindly words ensuring the same dreadful transaction would continue. Hartwell hit cold earth and looked up at faces he had trusted, now weathered into something else. The barn lid clattered shut above, sealing the ceremony in oak and nail. He thought of his mother's folded apron, of streets in Cincinnati he would not recognize again, of the ledger he had sworn to keep honest. A child's small hand pressed to his cheek, trembling, and whispered, "Remember us." The whisper split something open inside him, a place that would never mend again. Hartwell's eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness of the pit. It was deeper than he had imagined, an excavation that defied casual measurement. The walls were damp, coated in a powdery white residue, lime, thick and choking. Every step forward kicked up small clouds that stung his lungs. The child's hand remained clasped in his, fragile yet insistent, a tether to reality in a place where reality had surrendered. The pit was not empty. Shallow depressions carved into the earth held shapes under burlap or tattered cloth. Some moved weakly, small whimpers echoing against stone-hard walls. Others were still, unnervingly so, as if sleep or death had claimed them both. Hartwell could not tell, and a part of him feared knowing. Above him, the barn roof groaned with the weight of the unseen horrors still stirring. Caleb Grimby's voice carried down faintly, counting, directing, orchestrating the silence of these trapped souls. "Order," he said, and the pit obeyed. Hartwell knelt beside one child. Pale, too thin, and eyes that had seen too much. The child whispered a single word, "They come for us, always." He understood then. This was not a single act of cruelty, it was a system, perfected over years. Every inspector, every well-meaning traveler, every letter that went unanswered had been accounted for, manipulated, neutralized, and yet, in the shadowed corners of the pit, Hartwell saw something else, signs of life that refused to be extinguished. Fingers gripping the earth, tiny mouths crying without voice, the faint rhythm of breathing that refused death. These children, or what remained of them, had learned the rules of survival in a place where the law had abandoned them. Hartwell realized the Grimbys had built more than an orphanage. They had constructed a machine of control, teaching silence, obedience, and the art of disappearing. Every move above ground, smiles for Neeg. Boer's polite conversations with officials was mirrored by terror below. He wrote in his journal with shaking hands, "There is no justice here, only maintenance. No evil is random. It is cultivated," and as he lifted his head, he saw movement in the shadows, something vast, coiled beneath the earth, waiting. The Grimbys were not alone in this orchestration. The pit itself had become a living mechanism of horror, and Hartwell was now a part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. Hartwell worked in whispers and shadows, his journal a lifeline to sanity. Every line he wrote carved the truth into something permanent, something the Grimby family could not erase. But each word was a gamble. One misstep, one sound, and the dark machinery above could undo him entirely. He noted every detail, the children's positions, the markings on their skin, the patterns of the burlap bundles, the irregularities in the pit floor. Every observation painted a picture more horrific than the last, a carefully maintained web of control where the Grimbys orchestrated life and death with meticulous precision. This was no ordinary family, no mere cruelty born of temperament. They were artisans of terror, their craft honed over a decade. He documented the feeding rituals, the strange chants, the coordinated movements of Caleb and the boys. The sheriff and the woman with the crook were active participants, their presence legitimizing the horror. Hartwell realized the entire town was complicit, at least passively. The silence of neighbors, the willful ignorance of inspectors, even the patterns of trade and supply, all were cogs in a machine that demanded obedience and punished curiosity. Yet in the darkness, Hartwell also found resilience. A child had scratched symbols into the pit wall, crude but deliberate, circles within triangles, repeated 3 times. It was a signal, a code, a mark of identity. These children were not entirely lost, they had learned to resist silently, to communicate in ways the Grimbys could not fully control. Hartwell's hands shook as he copied these signs into his journal, knowing that even recording them could be deadly if discovered. Every sound above, the scrape of a boot, the shift of a board, made his heart leap. But documenting this was the only way he could fight back. Evidence, meticulous and undeniable, could awaken the outside world to the existence of something so carefully hidden that most would refuse to believe it. And yet, as he paused to catch his breath, a thought struck him harder than fear ever had. Exposing the Grimbys would not only destroy them, it would reveal the complicity of everyone who had looked the other way. Neighbors, officials, inspectors, clergy. The darkness above ground was no less structured than the pit below. Hartwell had stumbled into a network of lies and control that extended far beyond Medina County. He whispered to himself, almost a vow, "I will not let them erase this. I will carry it into the light." Hartwell's journal trembled in his hands as he realized the truth. The Grimby operation was not confined to the walls of that pit or the barn above it. Every detail he had observed pointed to a network of silent enablers, neighbors who avoided the orphanage, merchants who delivered supplies without questioning, officials who praised the Grimbys' perfect records. The town itself had become a silent accomplice, a living camouflage for atrocities hidden in plain sight. He traced the pathways in his mind. Supply deliveries of lime, adult food rations, and cleaning materials, always indirect, never questioned. Visitors, carefully screened, granted access only to empty classrooms or sterile corridors. Every missing child, every unverified placement out west, was accounted for through deception, lies, and meticulous record-keeping. The machinery of evil extended like a spiderweb across the county, touching every official, every observer who preferred convenience over truth. Escape seemed impossible. Even if he could flee the pit physically, the shadows of the Grimbys' influence would follow him. Any attempt to alert authorities could be blocked by forged records, silenced witnesses, or misdirection. Every strategy Hartwell considered ended in the same realization: the pit was just one layer of a much larger structure, one whose foundations were embedded deep into the town itself. He looked at the children around him, some whispering, some frozen in silence. Their eyes held knowledge he could barely comprehend. They had learned the rules of survival under the Grimby system, moving like shadows within shadows, existing in a state of suspended fear. One small hand pressed to his arm reminded him that they depended on him, that his choices could mean life or death. Hartwell mapped the barn in his mind, memorizing hidden exits, weak floorboards, ventilation shafts, even the light gaps where the Grimby surveillance could fail. He knew he would need every ounce of ingenuity, courage, and patience to survive what was coming. But the truth had anchored him. He could not turn back. In that moment, he realized something even darker. The Grimbys didn't just hide children, they trained observers, cultivated silence, and weaponized fear. The pit, the barn, the orphanage, they were all instruments of control, teaching the town, the officials, and even himself a terrifying lesson about obedience and complicity. Hartwell exhaled slowly, steeling himself. To escape the pit, to expose the truth, I must first become part of the system without being consumed by it. Hartwell settled into a narrow crevice between two damp walls, the child pressed close to him, their small warmth a fragile shield against the cold dread that filled the pit. Every plan he had considered was a perilous gamble. The Grimbys had eyes in every shadow, ears in every room. Yet he knew instinctively that to survive and to expose them, he would need evidence, proof so undeniable that it could pierce the veil of complicity surrounding Medina County. He observed silently as the children below learned the rhythm of the Grimbys' rituals, their bodies moving in practiced obedience. Every step, every whispered instruction from Caleb or the woman with the crook was a lesson in submission, in survival. Hartwell took careful notes in his journal, encoding details with symbols the children had shown him, the circles, the triangles, marks that could be traced above ground later. This was not just documentation, it was a language of resistance. From his vantage point, he could watch the movements above ground as well. The barn doors, the windows, the way Caleb and his cohorts handled the bundles at night, everything was choreographed, rehearsed to minimize exposure. Hartwell began to see patterns in the chaos, when supplies arrived, when inspections occurred, even when neighbors walked too close to the property. The Grimbys' control extended not only over their victims but over perception itself. He whispered instructions to the child, teaching subtle movements to record observations unnoticed, a tap on the floor to mark a shift in activity, a soft hum to signal danger. The children became allies in a delicate dance of surveillance, learning to gather and preserve information without alerting their captors. It was slow, painstaking work, but every detail they collected built toward the inevitable confrontation with the outside world. Hartwell realized the stakes. Discov. Eri meant immediate death, not just for him, but for the children who trusted him. Yet the weight of silence was unbearable. If he did not act, if he allowed the Grimbys' horrors to remain hidden, he would be complicit as surely as those who had looked the other way for decades. As he mapped the barn in his mind, memorizing hidden exits, weak floorboards, and gaps in surveillance, he understood that his every breath, every movement, and every whispered note could determine who lived and who became another nameless addition to the pit. The orchestration of evil demanded respect, strategy, and nerves of steel, and Hartwell's mind sharpened with a single, unyielding purpose, to turn the Grimby system against itself, to capture proof that could awaken a town, a state, a nation, to the depths of their deception. Night descended like a suffocating shroud over the Grimby property. Hartwell crouched in the shadows, the child pressed against his chest, both of them silent as the wind whispered through the trees. Above, the barn seemed to breathe, the floorboards creaking under the careful footsteps of its dark architects. Tonight, he would see everything, the full choreography of horror that had remained hidden from outsiders for so long. Caleb emerged first, carrying bundles swaddled in coarse burlap. His eyes glinted in the lantern light, pale and calculating, cataloging everything, every movement, every sound. Behind him, the woman with the crook chanted softly, a melodic cadence that twisted the air into tension and fear. The boys followed, disciplined, silent, their expressions void of conscience, carrying tools that would make a mortal shiver. Hartwell's stomach churned as the bundles were placed near the pit. One by one, the Grimbys lifted them carefully, lowering the contents into the depths with mechanical precision. The children below stirred, whimpers soft and restrained, like notes in a dirge. Hartwell realized the bundles weren't just children, they were instruments of control, teaching obedience through terror. The chanting grew louder, synchronized with the methodical movement of limbs and tools. Hartwell saw how the pit itself had become a stage, the Grimby's its conductor, orchestrating fear with calculated rhythm. Each child lowered, each small movement recorded, each sound constrained. It was ritual, punishment, and lesson intertwined. Then he noticed something that froze him cold, markings on the pit walls, symbols repeated from the children's coded scratches, but larger, deliberate, and fresh. They were tracking compliance, submission, and rebellion, a ledger of defiance and obedience written in chalk and blood. Hartwell's heart pounded as he realized the full scale of the system. The Grimbys weren't just hiding crimes, they were cultivating a machinery of psychological control, refining it night after night. A small movement caught his eye. One of the children had hidden a bundle beneath a loose board, resisting. Caleb noticed instantly, his gaze slicing the darkness. The punishment was swift, precise, ritualized. Hartwell averted his eyes, fighting nausea, but he recorded every motion in his mind and in his journal. This evidence, unbearable as it was, would be his weapon. As the ritual ended, Hartwell understood the terrifying truth: the pit, the barn, the orphanage, they were all extensions of the same force. And every night, that force grew stronger, learning from every misstep, every flicker of defiance, every attempt at escape. Hartwell had memorized every shadow, every corner of the barn, every crack in the floorboards. Tonight, he ventured deeper than before, toward a narrow door at the rear of the main hall that Caleb had never mentioned. The air grew colder as he approached, the scent of lime sharp and metallic in his nostrils. Behind this door lay the Grimby family's most guarded secret, a ledger said to contain every child's name, every placement, every death, a record that could expose decades of atrocities. The lock yielded under careful hands, a soft click echoing like a gunshot in the hollow barn. Inside, the room was small, lined with shelves of brittle papers and bound books. Hartwell's lantern flickered, illuminating a desk that had been meticulously organized. There it was, the ledger. Its leather cover was cracked with age, a faint layer of dust giving way to faint bloodstains. He hesitated, knowing that opening it was akin to opening a tomb. He turned the pages slowly, each entry a testament to deception and calculated cruelty. Names crossed out, replaced, or noted as transferred to families who did not exist. Dates aligned with missing children, with Hartwell's own observations, with the pit below. It was all there, the pattern, the system, the precision. The Grimbys were not amateurs. They had curated their horror with a scholar's diligence and a surgeon's attention to detail. Some entries were more disturbing, symbols alongside names, indicating the method of punishment or containment. Hartwell recognized the children's coded marks etched in the pit. Here, they were expanded, explained, catalogued. Each symbol a key to understanding the depths of the Grimby's control. The ledger wasn't just a record, it was a manifesto of manipulation, a blueprint for terror that had ensnared an entire community. As he photographed the pages with a small, concealable camera, Hartwell felt the weight of every life trapped, every scream silenced. This ledger, if exposed, could bring the Grimbys to justice. But it could also unleash panic, shame, and disbelief across Medina County. Those who had turned a blind eye would face the consequences of complicity. Hartwell closed the ledger carefully, breathing steadily to mask the tremor in his chest. He understood now the true power of knowledge, dangerous, transformative, irreversible. Holding it in his hands, he felt the burden of responsibility settle like a stone in his stomach. Tonight, he would leave the room alive. But carrying this proof into the light meant a descent into even deeper darkness, a confrontation with forces who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Hartwell moved like a shadow, each step measured, deliberate, every sense straining for the faintest sound. The ledger tucked beneath his coat was a weight heavier than any physical burden. It carried the voices of the lost, the silent testimonies of children erased from history, and the blueprint of a darkness the county had ignored for decades. One misstep and it could all be gone. The barn above was alive with subtle motion. Caleb's pale eyes scanned the hallways, the faintest creak of floorboards announcing each patrol. Hartwell froze behind a stack of crates, feeling the pulse of fear ripple through him, matching the rhythm of his own heartbeat. He watched as a lantern swung past, illuminating a row of empty barrels, shadows stretching and twisting like silent witnesses. Each breath was a gamble, each heartbeat, a countdown that he glanced at the child pressed to his side. The small hand gripping his sleeve was a lifeline, a tether to purpose. Hartwell whispered instructions, teaching silence as a language, patience as a weapon. Every child was a partner now, every observation a thread in a delicate tapestry of survival and exposure. They could not slip, not now, not ever. A floorboard creaked. Hartwell's chest tightened, every instinct screaming that discovery was imminent. Caleb's voice called softly from the loft above, a calculated menace, "Check below. Make sure nothing is missing." Hartwell stilled, counting, listening, becoming part of the darkness. The child pressed closer, their whispered breathing the only sound he allowed himself to acknowledge. When the moment came, Hartwell slipped through the side door, the night swallowing him whole. Outside, the crisp Ohio air bit at his lungs, reminding him he was still alive, still capable of action. But he knew this escape was temporary. Caleb would notice, the ledger would be sought, and the Grimby's reach ended further than he had imagined. They had prepared for this eventuality, as they had for everything else. Hartwell ducked into the trees, cataloging every patrol route, every weak point, every routine that could be exploited. He knew the ledger was more than evidence, it was a spark, a weapon, and a curse. Carrying it into the light meant exposing not just the Grimby family, but the silent complicity of an entire town. As he melted into the shadows, Hartwell whispered a vow, almost to himself, "I will bring the truth out. I will honor the children. I will not let this darkness persist." Hartwell moved carefully through Medina County, ledger hidden beneath layers of coat and canvas, his every step measured against the unseen eyes he knew were searching. The town had become a maze of suspicion, a place where silence and routine were weapons of compliance. He could not trust anyone fully, not merchants, not officials, not even casual acquaintances. The Grimby's influence was woven into the very fabric of the community, subtle, pervasive, and deadly. He sought allies cautiously, choosing those who had glimpsed oddities, who had questioned the Grimby operation, who carried the weight of silent awareness. One by one, he approached these people under the guise of benign visits, conversations over coffee, casual remarks in public, but always testing, always reading the signs of fear, curiosity, and courage. Each ally was vetted, each trust measured, because a single mistake could cost lives. Together, in secret, they began to piece together the fragments of truth. The ledger, the children's coded scratches, eyewitness accounts, Hartwell's photographs, all became part of a growing mosaic of evidence. They cross-referenced deliveries, inspections, and reported placements against the ledger's entries. Every inconsistency, every erased name, every suspicious transfer illuminated the careful orchestration of the Grimby's crimes. Hartwell realized the network extended further than he had imagined. People who had smiled politely, who had praised the Grimby home, were either complicit or paralyzed by fear. Some were enablers who consciously ignored the atrocities, others were unwilling participants, bound by economic or social pressure. Every thread he pulled revealed another knot in a web of silence, a web designed to protect one family while erasing countless children. In these secret meetings, Hartwell began planning the exposure of the Grimby operation. He knew that mere accusations would be dismissed. They needed irrefutable proof, ledger entries, photographs, eyewitness testimony, and the coded marks of the children themselves. Only then could they confront the town, the state, and the structures that had allowed this horror to persist. And yet, even as he strategized, Hartwell understood the personal cost. The ledger was more than evidence, it was a living embodiment of darkness. To wield it, to reveal the truth, meant carrying the weight of every lost child, every silent witness, every act of complicity. It would change him, irrevocably. Hartwell whispered to his allies, a low, commanding tone meant to steel them for what lay ahead. We do not just expose the Grimbys. We confront the darkness that hid them, the darkness that exists everywhere that men look the other way. The night Hartwell knew would come finally arrived. Shadows clung to the Grimby property like living things, and somewhere inside, Caleb sensed the breach. The house, the barn, the pit, they were all under his surveillance, his control, and yet a ripple of uncertainty had begun to spread. Hartwell's careful maneuvers, the missing bundles, the whispered inquiries in town, they had not gone unnoticed. Caleb moved through the halls with the precision of a predator. His pale eyes scanned every corner, cataloging absence, measuring threat. Jeremiah and Martha lingered in the background, outwardly calm, but Hartwell sensed their tension. Even years of orchestrating terror could not inoculate them against the fear that came with exposure. For the first time, the Grimby family felt vulnerable. Hartwell approached from the shadows, ledger in hand, a record of every secret they had meticulously hidden. He knew the risks. Discovery could mean death, not just for him, but for the children who had come to trust him. Yet the ledger was their weakness, their Achilles heel. Every page a mirror of the lies, every entry a trap waiting to be sprung. The confrontation began subtly, a flicker of light, the sound of footsteps where none should have been. Caleb's voice sliced through the silence. Who's there? Hartwell remained hidden, observing, cataloging. The predator had become aware, and the dance of control had shifted. Hartwell had become the observer, the manipulator, the threat the Grimbys had not anticipated. Inside, the children trembled, whispers passing between them, signals, codes, small acts of resistance learned in silence. Hartwell used their courage, their ingenuity, to move unseen, to position evidence, to prepare the moment that would shatter the carefully constructed facade. The ledger was more than paper, it was leverage, a weapon of revelation that could overturn decades of fear. Caleb's strategy was methodical. He checked doors, windows, and hidden corners, unaware that Hartwell had already anticipated each move. Each creak, each shift in the lantern light, each shadow was a calculated piece of the confrontation. Hartwell was not merely surviving, he was orchestrating exposure, turning the Grimbys' obsession with control into a vulnerability. By the end of the night, the first fissure had appeared in the Grimby armor. A misstep, a whisper, a subtle disturbance in the rhythm of fear. Hartwell had survived, the ledger intact, and the family shaken. The path ahead was still perilous, but the seed of truth had been planted. Hartwell knew that survival alone was not enough. The ledger, the photographs, the coded scratches, they were proof, but proof without action was meaningless. He began the careful process of contacting authorities, allies, and sympathetic townsfolk who had quietly resisted the Grimby influence. Every message was coded, every meeting clandestine, for one misstep could undo everything. The sheriff, initially skeptical, became uneasy as Hartwell presented fragments of evidence, the ledger entries, the photographs of empty classrooms, the children's desperate marks carved into furniture. Each piece undermined the Grimbys' meticulously maintained facade. The veneer of respectability began to crack under scrutiny, and whispers started to ripple through Medina County. Hartwell organized the evidence with methodical precision. He separated the ledger into chronological sections, cross-referencing each child's placement with local testimonies, shipments of supplies, and the occasional photograph showing a child peering fearfully from a window. This was not merely an accusation, it was an unassailable architecture of truth designed to withstand the Grimbys' attempts at manipulation and denial. In private, Hartwell trained the children who had survived, teaching them how to recount their experiences without fear, how to leave coded messages that could later serve as testimony. They became co-authors of their own liberation, translating years of silent terror into a narrative of revelation. The ledger, once a document of control, had become a blueprint for resistance. As word began to circulate, the Grimbys sensed the tightening noose. Caleb's once calm, calculating demeanor faltered in the presence of unexpected questions from neighbors and officials. Jeremiah and Martha, ever careful, grew visibly tense, their practiced masks of piety cracking. Hartwell watched from a distance. Ants, noting the subtle cues, the hesitation, the repeated glances, the way shadows seemed to cling more closely around them. The first stage of exposure was complete, the town was awake, the authorities attentive, and the Grimbys aware that their carefully orchestrated illusion was unraveling. Hartwell's meticulous strategy had shifted the balance of power. The ledger was no longer just a record, it was a weapon of liberation, a key to unlocking decades of hidden evil. He paused, knowing that the next steps would be decisive. The Grimbys would fight to protect their secrets, but the machinery of fear was no match for carefully applied truth. Every shadow he had studied, every movement he had recorded, would now serve as evidence to dismantle the empire of terror. The morning the Grimby family was confronted by law enforcement was colder than any Ohio winter Hartwell had known. Sheriff Braden, finally acting on the irrefutable evidence, arrived with a small contingent of deputies. The ledger, photographs, and witness testimonies had shifted the balance decisively. The Grimbys, once untouchable pillars of the community, now faced the first tangible consequence of decades of meticulously concealed evil. Caleb's face was pale, the mask of control slipping with each step the officers took through the barn and into the orphanage. Jeremiah's imposing presence had shrunk under the weight of scrutiny, and Martha's nervous whispers were drowned out by the authority of law. The children, hidden behind doors and beneath beds, watched as the household's carefully maintained rhythm of terror unraveled. For them, this was the first taste of hope, the first crack in a prison built of fear. Hartwell observed quietly from the edges, cataloging every reaction, every subtle gesture of the Grimbys as they were escorted from room to room. It was a theater of revelation, each room a stage for the truth to assert itself over decades of lies. The ledger had done its work, every child accounted for, every entry cross-referenced, every omission exposed. The machinery of psychological control that had enslaved them all was now laid bare. The townspeople, summoned quietly by Hartwell and his allies, arrived to witness the first confrontation. Their expressions ranged from disbelief to horror to guilt. Many realized that their willful ignorance, their silent complicity, had allowed the Grimbys' crimes to continue unchallenged. Hartwell understood that justice was not only legal, it was social, a reckoning that demanded acknowledgement of communal failure. As the Grimbys were led away, Caleb's icy stare met Hartwell's for the first time in years. It was not fear but recognition, a recognition that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The ledger, the photographs, and the children's testimonies had stripped away the aura of invincibility, revealing them as mortal, fallible, and exposed. Hartwell breathed deeply, feeling the weight of victory tempered by the gravity of the horrors unearthed. This was only the beginning. The town would take years to process the truth, the children would require decades to heal. Yet, the darkness that had been hidden in plain sight was now illuminated, and for Hartwell, the lesson was clear: knowledge is the ultimate weapon. Those who wield it with courage can shatter empires of fear, unmask the corrupt, and honor the silent voices the world tried to forget. The aftermath of the Grimby arrests was a storm that no one in Medina County could escape. Families whispered in hushed tones, neighbors avoided eye contact, and the town's institutions faced a reckoning they had long evaded. Hartwell knew that revealing the ledger and the photographs was only half the battle. The other half was awakening the community to the depths of its complicity and denial. The children, once silenced by fear and coercion, began to emerge from hiding. Their voices were tentative, fragile, yet charged with a raw power that shook the foundations of every listener. Each story was a thread pulled from a tapestry of terror, weaving together years of abuse, manipulation, and fear. Hartwell guided them carefully, teaching them to speak truth to power, to articulate their experiences with precision, and to reclaim their identities from the shadows the Grimbys had imposed. The town's clergy, who had once lauded the Grimby family as paragons of Christian virtue, faced their own moral collapse. Sermons and meetings attempted to reconcile faith with the undeniable evidence of evil that had thrived under the guise of piety. Some retreated into denial, clinging to familiar narratives; others acknowledged the truth, a painful admission that their silence had enabled unspeakable acts. Hartwell, standing in the quiet of the orphanage grounds, reflected on the power of controlled exposure. The ledger had forced the Grimbys into vulnerability. The children's stories were now forcing the community to confront its own shadow. Every confession, every memory shared, deepened the descent into a reality few were prepared to face, that evil can thrive under respectability, that systems of care can become cages, and that silence is as lethal as any weapon. Halfway through this reckoning, Hartwell addressed his allies and the surviving children directly. He asked them to commit to a symbolic phrase aloud, not once, but twice: "We remember. We rise." This act, seemingly simple, was a psychological anchor, a declaration of identity, resistance, and transformation. In repeating it, they were not only affirming their own survival but also embedding the truth in the collective consciousness, ensuring it would reverberate beyond the confines of Medina County. By the end of the day, the town's perception of the Grimby orphanage had shifted irreversibly. What was once regarded as charity was now understood as calculated cruelty. The ledger, once a document of control, had become a weapon of liberation, a mirror reflecting the depths of human darkness and the power of courage to illuminate it. The exposure of the Grimby operation rippled far beyond Medina County. Newspapers, previously constrained by local deference and fear, finally published accounts that shocked Ohio and the wider United States. Hartwell worked quietly behind the scenes, supplying reporters with photographs, excerpts from the ledger, and verified testimonies. Every page was a revelation, every photograph a confrontation with a truth too long hidden. State officials, forced into action by public outcry, initiated a formal investigation. Hartwell observed as inspectors combed the orphanage grounds, counting graves, verifying records, and comparing ledger entries with local reports. Each discovery further dismantled the carefully constructed illusion the Grimbys had maintained for decades. What had been dismissed as rumor now carried the weight of irrefutable proof. The legal system, slow but methodical, began to process the charges. Caleb, Jeremiah, and Martha faced a litany of accusations: murder, neglect, fraud, and abuse. Hartwell's evidence was the backbone of the case, the narrative that allowed law to confront an evil systemically disguised as benevolence. Courtrooms filled with spectators, many grappling with disbelief, shame, or vindication. For some, the trial was an awakening; for others, it was confirmation of fears long suppressed. Simultaneously, social reformers seized upon the case as a cautionary tale. The Grimby ledger became a study in institutional manipulation, psychological control, and the vulnerabilities inherent in oversight systems. Advocates called for stricter regulations, more frequent inspections, and a cultural shift in how orphanages and charitable institutions were monitored. Hartwell's meticulous documentation provided the blueprint for reform, ensuring that the Grimbys' methods could not easily be replicated. The children, once silent, now spoke openly. Their narratives woven into the court record. Their words carried the weight of lived experience, transforming abstract evidence into palpable horror. They were no longer victims only, they had become witnesses, teachers, and symbols of resilience. Hartwell understood that their courage was the keystone of justice. Amid the legal chaos and societal reckoning, Hartwell remained a silent observer, knowing that the ledger's power extended beyond any single trial. It was proof of a reality too easily ignored, that evil can hide behind respectability, that psychological control can manipulate entire communities, and that the deliberate silence of the many enables the crimes of the few. Even as the courts moved through the Grimby case, Hartwell could feel the invisible weight of the ledger pressing down on him. Nights were restless, haunted by the faces of children whose lives had been stolen, and by the silent complicity of neighbors, officials, and clergy. The ledger was no longer just a record of evil, it had become a mirror, reflecting the darkness in every institution that claimed moral authority while turning a blind eye to cruelty. The psychological toll on the children was profound. Trauma, once suppressed, now surfaced with relentless intensity. Hartwell spent hours guiding them, teaching them to confront memories that had been buried under layers of fear. Every recollection, every whispered confession, was an act of liberation, yet it carried the weight of loss. These children had survived, but survival demanded they carry the story, and with it, the scars that could never fully heal. For the town, the revelation shattered a carefully maintained illusion of safety and virtue. Families questioned long-held assumptions, neighbors struggled with guilt, and the community wrestled with the realization that evil can operate in plain sight, hidden beneath the mask of benevolence. Hartwell observed this reckoning silently, knowing that the cultural and moral shifts would take generations to fully unfold. The ledger had forced not just accountability but awareness, a kind of collective awakening that was as uncomfortable as it was necessary. Hartwell also recognized the Grimbys' enduring influence, even in absence. Their psychological control had seeped into routines, etiquette, and social expectations. For years, the orphanage had modeled obedience, fear, and secrecy as the tools of compliance. Dismantling these subtle systems of manipulation would require vigilance, education, and a refusal to return to old patterns of denial. Amid all this, Hartwell reflected on his own transformation. He was no longer the city photographer, a neutral observer of life's rhythms. He had become a guardian of truth, a catalyst for justice, and a witness to human darkness. The ledger had changed him as much as it had changed the town, binding him to a responsibility he could never relinquish, to ensure the children's voices would echo beyond Medina County, to expose the structures that allow cruelty to flourish, and to illuminate the hidden forces that operate behind every facade of respectability. As night fell over the county, Hartwell whispered to the surviving children, reinforcing a mantra he had begun teaching them: "We remember. We rise." Twice, in unison, their voices reverberated through the hollow spaces of the orphanage, a defiant echo against the darkness that had once reigned there. The Grimby case reverberated far beyond the forests and fields of Medina County. Reformers seized upon the horrors documented in the ledger, the photographs, and the children's testimonies as undeniable evidence that existing systems of oversight were fatally flawed. Hartwell watched from the shadows as committees convened in Columbus and Cincinnati, debates ignited in newspapers, and new laws were drafted with the explicit goal of preventing such abuses from ever recurring. Child welfare, previously fragmented and loosely enforced, began to shift toward rigorous regulation. Orphanages were no longer assumed to be inherently virtuous. Inspections became more frequent, detailed, and accountable. Policies governing adoption, placement, and oversight incorporated lessons drawn directly from the Grimby ledger. Hartwell understood that the Grimby's crimes, though unspeakably vile, had inadvertently catalyzed a transformation in institutional care across the state. Their depravity became a template for reform. Communities began to question the balance between trust and oversight. Clergy, civic leaders, and philanthropists wrestled with the uncomfortable realization that respectability and virtue could conceal darkness. Hartwell's photographs and ledger entries were presented in public forums, not as sensational spectacle, but as grim illustrations of the consequences of willful ignorance. Each image, each account, was a lesson in vigilance, a warning that moral authority without accountability is fertile ground for corruption. For the children, the reforms were symbolic as much as practical. They gained legal recognition, protections that had been denied for years, and a platform from which their experiences could inform change. Their survival became a tool of empowerment, not just for themselves, but for countless other children who, across Ohio and beyond, might otherwise have been subjected to hidden horrors. Hartwell reflected on the paradox of power. The same ledger that had enslaved the children's identities for years had now become the foundation of societal awakening. Darkness, once meticulously concealed, had become illumination. The Grimby's legacy, though rooted in evil, forced a confrontation with the very structures that enable cruelty, silence, complicity, and systemic neglect, and yet, Hartwell knew that history rarely offers clean endings. The ledger remained, a dangerous artifact of truth, a reminder that evil can be hidden anywhere, that vigilance is perpetual, and that knowledge is both weapon and responsibility. The town of Medina County would never forget, and neither would he. Now, after decades of silence, the ledger, the photographs, and the children's testimony stand as a testament to what the world is capable of hiding, and what it can endure when truth is wielded with courage. Hartwell's work was not simply exposure, it was initiation into a deeper understanding of human nature, the systems that protect evil, and the silent complicity that allows it to thrive. The Grimby family, once untouchable, became a symbol, not just of horror, but of the consequences of absolute control. Their downfall revealed the fragility of facades, the potency of evidence, and the transformative power of witnessing. For those who observed, who dared to confront the ledger, the experience was not entertainment. It was instruction, a guide to seeing the hidden mechanisms of manipulation, the shadows behind charity, and the subtle architecture of fear that governs institutions and communities alike. Hartwell's voice, once quiet and methodical, became a beacon for vigilance. He reminded those who listened that evil rarely announces itself with grandiosity. It thrives in silence, in respectability, in the unexamined corners of human systems. The ledger was dangerous not because it contained names and dates, but because it illuminated patterns that repeat wherever power is unchecked, wherever conscience is deferred, wherever society trusts appearances over evidence. The children, now adults, carried the scars of the Grimby orphanage, yet also the power of their own survival. They were living proof that courage, observation, and persistence can dismantle even the most meticulously maintained empires of fear. Their repeated mantra, "We remember. We rise," echoed far beyond the Ohio forests, a symbolic incantation of identity, resistance, and transformation. Twice spoken, it anchored them to reality, to truth, and to the possibility of reclaiming power. It had been stolen, and you, watching now, must confront the ledger in your mind. Its pages are not just history, they are a lens. A lens to recognize the hidden forces that manipulate, the institutions that conceal, the families and leaders who wear virtue as a mask for corruption. You must see the patterns, understand the tactics, and remember that awareness is a weapon more potent than any law. In the quiet of your own life, consider the Grimbys, not as distant monsters, but as a warning. Respectability is not safety. Silence is not innocence. And knowledge is the only way to rise. We remember. We rise.